All right, guys, I'm going to press go live now. All right, we are now live. For those of you who are just joining, we thought we were live about 4 minutes ago, but we actually weren't. So we are now live. My name is Cameron. I'm with TinyBird. I've also got Alasdair Brown and Alex Dovenmuehle with me here. Alasdair is also with TinyBird. Alex is now with Big Time Data, but he's the ex-Heroku guy that all of you are here to see and hear from. So, Alasdair, why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll jump over to Alex.
Yeah. So, hey, I'm Alasdair, customer success at TinyBird. I've been in big data for
8 years.
8 years, and mostly in sort of the real-time streaming space. I started originally in cybersecurity, managed to get around and touch most industries from there, and play with a lot of fun tools. I'll be staying mostly quiet and just absorbing the intelligence from Alex.
That's what I think most of us will be doing. So anyways, cool. Alex, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll kind of introduce the topic and we'll get going.
Perfect. So I am the co-founder at Big Time Data. My other co-founder, Rachel, and I started Big Time Data about 1.5 years ago. We actually met at Heroku about 6 years ago. And I'm going to make a whole long story short. I ended up running the data engineering team, doing all the data warehousing, that kind of stuff. And then Rachel ended up doing go-to-market operations and analytics at Heroku. Towards the end of 2019, Heroku was getting a little too Salesforcey, and we decided to leave, and we went to a company called Mattermost, which we built their entire data infrastructure there, and then we also built their usage-based billing system with Stripe. And then the system was just kind of running itself, so we were getting kind of bored, and we were kind of doing some moonlighting, some free consulting work for people, and we were like, wow, this is a lot more fun than our day job. We should just do this all the time. So we did. So that was February of 2021. Wow, that's crazy. And we've been going strong for about 1.5 years. And so Big Time Data will do anything from starting your data infrastructure from scratch, setting up your initial data warehouse, setting up your visualization tools, setting up reverse ETL, all that kind of stuff. And we really believe data is only valuable if it's actionable and consumable in a good way. And so that's what we kind of focus on. One of the things also that I've always ended up doing is usage-based billing implementations for different companies, because billing is hard. And if you're only going to take one thing from this webinar, take billing is hard as a thing.
Billing is hard. Got it.
Yeah, that's the first one. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. So
sweet.
Let's
Yeah.
That is what we're before we get any further, now that we've done our second round of intros, Cameron, are we definitely live?
We are definitely live. Yes, confirmed. Yeah,
nice.
I have had people tell me that yes, we are live. So I mean, we're gonna talk about usage-based pricing and kind of loosely talk about just build versus buy. I think a lot of people are looking at usage-based pricing. Maybe they're implementing it, they're thinking about it, or maybe trying to figure out if they should think about it, whatever. But the point is, people have options. There's a lot of SaaS tools out there that you can buy to help you implement usage-based pricing. You can also build it from scratch. There's some stuff in between. And given Alex's experience building, a usage-based pricing system kind of from the ground up at Heroku, and then also at Mattermost, but I think we'll talk mostly about the Heroku days. We wanted to get him on and just kind of walk through that with people. So I'm going to get rid of that ugly slide and just pull us up here. So I think, Alex, first of all, let's just start by, I want to ask, what exactly did you build at Heroku? What was it doing? We'll get into how you approach the problem, but what did you build? What was it accomplishing for you guys?
Yeah, so just so I mean, I would assume that anybody who's on this call would know what Heroku is, but in case you don't know what Heroku is, it was a platform as a service product. Their main claim to fame was the developer experience. Git push Heroku master. You just push your Ruby code and it would just magically run in the cloud. And at the time, this stuff was revolutionary, right? You didn't have any Kubernetes. You didn't really have containers. I don't think Docker was really a thing back in those days. So it was like magic to people, right? And it used, I think, a cutting edge, like usage-based pricing, right? Like I run a dyno, which is kind of like your web process, and I'll pay, I don't remember exactly what it was, like, $20 a month to have it running all the time. Or I could run like a Sidekick process, but I only want to run it half the time. So it's $10 a month or whatever. And we actually built to the millisecond, which was also kind of cool. So we also had, it was kind of like a freemium to enterprise type, let's call it sales model, right? So you would get people in on the free plan. You'd hope they would grow their website. They start paying you $25 a month, $50 a month, whatever. They turn into some big company, and then they sign an enterprise contract for like $1 million or whatever, right? That was the dream. So it was pretty cool. And when I joined, and this is all public information, by the way, because one of the recurring themes of this will be that Heroku was owned by Salesforce at the time, which is a publicly traded company. That'll be a factor. But when I joined, I think the first day, and I joined as a billing engineer, by the way. So I was actually on like the software developer side, not really the data engineering side at that point. But the first time I did billing, I think we charged probably 40, 50,000 credit cards for like $7 million. And that was on like a monthly basis. And then by the time I left, we were doing 80,000 credit cards a month with like 12 million. And then that's not even talking about all the enterprise stuff, which became a large part of the business towards the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what we were doing.
Yeah, gotcha. So I mean, first of all, so you chose to build from scratch. You didn't. I mean, I don't even know if there were like usage-based billing SaaS tools available at the time. So maybe you didn't have a choice. I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and it mentions kind of the tech stack you chose. You built it on Ruby, Elixir, Postgres, Redis, Bootstrap. Why those tools? That was over 5 years ago. Why did you choose those tools then? Maybe I'll ask you later what you do differently, but maybe just talk us through like that implementation, what that looked like, why you built it that way.
So before I had joined there, like a lot of companies, and we'll get into why this is a bad idea, but they sort of keep the billing stuff contained within sort of their like main monolith, whatever. And so basically all of Heroku, like the Heroku API is run with Ruby, right? And so what happened is they saw the need to start peeling these pieces out as they scaled. And so basically it got pulled out of the like main Heroku API, the billing stuff, into its own systems. And so that's kind of why we went with Ruby there, which I like Ruby. I don't write it that much anymore, but it's still a good language. We totally abused Postgres. And actually shout out to the DoD team at Heroku, because without them, we really couldn't have done like any of this. And just to give you a little flavor on like how this worked, and I'll get sort of into the architecture, is we kind of had like a microservice architecture, mostly written in Ruby. We kind of got into Elixir later down the road because Elixir is really freaking cool. But we had, and this kind of has informed the way I think about usage-based billing even today, is we had this service called the Vault Usage Service. And that essentially was what I have now termed the usage service. Amazing name, I know. I'm brilliant. But essentially what the usage service does is it is getting usage events about like customers using the product, right? Like, oh, they have like a Postgres server that they just spun up. They have this dyno running. They have this, they have that, right? And the point of the usage service is that you are tracking how much the customers are using your various products and features and whatever you're going to build on in terms of like your product domain, right? So usage service should really have nothing to do with billing, right? And so that way you can do things like, oh, I can show the customer a chart of like, here's how much stuff you're using. Doesn't have anything to do with dollars. It's just how much you're using, right? And then we have the entitlement service. This is the second service. And there's 3 services, so get ready. We're on a roller coaster here, folks. So the entitlement service is meant to be like, what is the customer actually entitled to? Like, what plan do they have? What features are they allowed to use? Is their subscription like active or inactive, right? And I'll get into why it's important to sort of peel these things conceptually out. But again, this really has nothing to do with billing, right? It's just like, here's what they have access to. Now, there's money involved, and we'll get into the next service, which is the billing service. And that's sort of where everything comes together and you're actually like charging people's credit cards or ACH or I don't know. Don't do crypto, guys. But, so it's going to pull data from the usage service, pull data from the entitlement service, and then it's going to create a bill for that customer for, however you need it to work. And we kind of had that at Heroku. It wasn't exactly defined that way, but that's sort of the way that I've started to think about it. And just to understand the scale of what we were abusing Postgres with, this usage service was getting, you can think about how much traffic Heroku was getting at the time. If we're charging 80,000 credit cards a month, you can imagine how much and that includes all the free usage and all that kind of stuff. So we were getting an event every time somebody spun up a dyno, spun down a dyno, all that kind of stuff. So we're talking like billions of records that were just persisting into Postgres, which we had the biggest Postgres instance you could get at Heroku, which I think if you paid list price was like something stupidly insane, like $10,000 a month or something. And not only did we have this Postgres database that was the $10,000 a month, we had 4 followers that were the same size. So now you're talking like 50,000, 40,000, whatever a month, just to run this billing service. And then we had to get into like partitioning and all sorts of, we were doing stuff that nobody should have done.
What made you choose Postgres then? Was this purely we already use it?
Yeah, it was. You think about at the time, right? Like Redshift was kind of on the scene. Kafka was really not a thing, or it wasn't very mature, right? We actually did, towards the end, we had started talking about like getting it onto Kafka, right? And I think that's probably, if you start thinking about it today, it's probably not a good idea to run all this stuff on Postgres. It's actually kind of a terrible idea. But we somehow made it work. But yeah, that was the main reason. Like Postgres was kind of the only hammer that we had, so we were just bashing shit with it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Which I love Postgres, so I'm not too sad about it.
So you were sending all of this to Postgres. Where were you collecting those events from in the first place?
So that's a good question. So there's kind of 2. I'll get into this story too. This one's fun. So there were 2 places that we were getting usage events from. Well, scratch that. It ended up becoming like 4, but things happen, whatever. The 2 main ones were the Heroku API, and that was specifically for add-ons, right? So if you went to Heroku and either through the API or through the GUI, you said like, I want a Postgres database of this size, spin it up for me, right? We would get an event that said this customer, started this Postgres instance this time, and it was this size, right? And obviously the size ends up doing the pricing. The other one was a system called PS Manager, Process Manager. And this was kind of the internal system that basically orchestrated running all the containers for all the apps and stuff. And so this one would tell us like, this customer ran this dyno of this size, starting this time, ending at that time, right? And so those were kind of the main ones. And so this is a fun story because you know those stories where like you really mess something up and you feel really bad about it and the whole company has to help deal with it? This is one of those stories. So basically the way the PS Manager worked is it would send us the start events, right? And then it had another process to like go through basically like a queue to say like, oh, these are stopped now, right? And this will be key to why this happened. And so the way Heroku worked is we built the invoices for everybody at night, right? At like 2 a.m. UTC or whatever the schedule was, right? I mean, you're talking like we were charging 80,000 credit cards, but we were really building like 700,000 invoices where almost all those 700,000 were free. And then, you know, there was the enterprise stuff, which was probably a few thousand or whatever. And so what had happened was one night they were having issues with PS Manager getting it to send the stop events. And, you know, a lot of these people would just run stuff like, oh, they just ran it for 5 minutes, right? But if we calculated their invoice and we hadn't got the stop event, well, now all of a sudden we think they were running for 12 hours or something like that, right? So I was on call. I get paged at like 5 a.m., which is always fun. So you wake up, you're like, what is going on? And as it turns out, after we built the invoices every night, we would send people an email that says, if this was the first time they owed us money, it would say like, hey, you just like went out of the free tier, you now owe us money, right? And usually it'd be like, oh, you owe us $3 or $5 or whatever, right? So all of a sudden, because of this issue, all these people who had been free for like years, right? Like they just ran their little website and it didn't really do much and all that, right? All of a sudden they get these emails that say, hey, you owe Heroku like $5,000. So now it's all over Twitter, it's all over Hacker News, and it was bad. So that took I worked for like 16 hours straight. I think I got paged at 5 a.m. and then I was up till like 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. like getting us all fixed up. And we had to you're scrambling like, oh, we got to find all the emails of all the people who got these crazy emails that said they owed thousands of dollars, and we have to do this, and we have to send out like an announcement and do all this crap. And I was like, oh my God, this is insane. Now, that was bad. But the good thing is now, like, anything can happen. And I just compare it to that situation. I'm like, it's not so bad.
Yeah.
Was there a moment initially where you thought, God, I've got a great system. I'm making the company so much money here. And then it kind of, you're like, oh, bollocks. No, actually.
Yeah. It was a rough time. It was a rough time. But we got through it.
Yeah, we've all been there.
And now Heroku has, a few months ago they had that whole GitHub issue. So I'm sure they felt the same way.
It happens.
I don't feel so bad anymore.
It's just part of life.
Yeah.
But so there's obviously, you could probably talk about your experience at Heroku for more than the time that we have. And, I want to transition a little bit to kind of this build versus buy question. But before I do that, I will just say, if you guys if you're on the stream and you want to ask a question, like you could ask it in the YouTube chat, we'll kind of address things in real time. But also if you have more questions about Alex's experience at Heroku, he's on LinkedIn, he's a nice guy. And obviously Big Time Data is helping a lot of people solve this usage-based billing problem. So he can help with that too. But so you guys chose to build kind of out of necessity at Heroku. There's obviously now a SaaS landscape, and it seems to actually be growing, in that there are a lot of companies that are now offering even like an API first approach to building usage-based billing. So can you just, briefly talk about, the landscape that's out there for those tools that are now available, and like what's good out there? What are people doing well? How's it helping?
Yeah, so it has been crazy to me actually, like within the last year, you've all of a sudden seen just like, to me, it felt like there was nothing a year and a half ago, and now there's like 10 of them doing this like usage-based billing play, which is, I mean, honestly needed. Like somebody needs to build this in a good and scalable way, because like Stripe, as amazing as it is, for a lot of usage-based stuff, isn't as perfect, especially if you go outside the realm of like a Slack or a Twilio, right? So Twilio, if you think about their billing model, right, it's just like, oh, they made a text message or whatever, right? Like it's just like increment 1. But when you start getting into more complicated billing models like Heroku and stuff, you kind of go outside the bounds of Stripe, and then that's where honestly, like I come in to help you figure out the best ways to do those kinds of things. But so now that we have Stripe, which I think, again, good product, great company. And now we are starting to see all these usage-based billing SaaS services, right? And one thing I've noticed about most of them, and there's been too many for me to go through all of them, but I have looked into a bunch of them. One thing that I think they're doing correct is sort of that usage service piece, ingesting that data in a like the correct way to be able to build these metrics that you want to bill people for. I think the other thing that I've seen that I like about them is, and this is kind of pros and cons, but they allow you to sort of build like these flexible pricing models where you can sort of like apply a pricing model to different customers. And that's especially valuable in like for startups who are trying to figure out their pricing model. And so they're always changing it. And it's like, if I don't have to go to the billing engineering team to like go redo all this stuff, that saves a lot of time. But I would say there is an alternate coin to that, because then you're going to end up having essentially like sales and operations people who probably shouldn't be messing with this stuff, and they do start messing with this stuff, and then you have a huge mess, and then you have to go clean it all up, and it's a whole nightmare. So it's not perfect. And I think that's, if you're going to take anything from this webinar, billing is like a Rubik's Cube. Like any little move you make messes with a move somewhere else, because really billing ends up becoming the sort of central point where like engineering cares about it, marketing and sales and operations, finance, accounting, like everybody has to sort of interact with the system in some way, like support I haven't even gotten into. And so like any little change you make that helps engineering or helps finance or whatever can cause pain for other people. And it's really like that, like what I try to do when I like work with clients on this stuff is try to like speak the language of all these different teams in the way that they can understand, and like try to keep it all straight. Because I think what happens a lot of times is you have just the people problem. It's like you have these engineers who, they write Go all day, they're in Kubernetes, they're doing this stuff. And then you have accounting who's in NetSuite, and they just think about accounting, and you know what I mean? Like sales just cares about their commission, right? They're coin operated humans. So like, they're totally different ways of thinking about things. And so, there's pros and cons, right, to everything like this. I think what I'm hoping to see is sort of one of these usage-based billing companies like really gets it right, finds that right balance. But I think right now, and I've like gone through this with clients currently, everything's just kind of too new. And especially to sort of trust your entire like billing infrastructure to this SaaS company that could be changing things all over the place.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one. Of you've given an example of where you messed up, right?
Yeah.
And it affected, but you're only doing the billing for your own company, so it affected your own customers. You buy a SaaS solution, they mess up, and all of the customers are impacted. And then what do you do then? Who's responsible?
And that actually keeps me up at night, just thinking about that. And actually, I actually talked to the founders of one of these companies, and I kind of asked them that, and they were like, "Yeah, it keeps us up at night too." But I'm like, well, that's a tough spot to be in, man. Although I guess you think about like Stripe they have to deal with that too. So I guess you can eventually get the trust that you need, but I don't know. It's dangerous. Actually, that does, like, one thing that I think was solid about the Heroku system was basically, I was talking about PS Manager, right? And it would send these events to Vault Usage. It would actually, so it would send the event, and then it would immediately call an API on the Vault Usage service to say, hey, what do you have for this usage, like, UUID, basically looking up. And it validated that, hey, I just sent this, and then it's acknowledging, like, yes, I got it, and this is what I have, right? Which a lot of these, that's one of the things about some of these usage SaaS tools that I've seen is, like, they have idempotency and stuff like that, but it's like, some of them seem to, like, aggregate the data on the fly, and then you lose that raw data. And then it's like, well, how do I match up what my source system said to what you have? I just have to trust that you aggregated it correctly, or, like, you didn't miss anything, or I didn't miss anything. So there's, again, billing is hard, so keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think it would actually be helpful too. So, like, I've been learning a little bit about this whole usage-based billing process, and as I understand it, there's kind of like 4 core kind of steps, right? There's the metering, which is what you've been talking about. It's actually ingesting the usage events and figuring out, like, what have people been doing that we could potentially bill for. Then there's the mediation, which is kind of figuring out, okay, which of these events are billable? How are they billable? How do we aggregate them, to your point? And then rating, which would then be actually applying pricing, which is complex in its own right, and then actually sending the invoice. That's kind of the 4 stages, I guess. Like, every SaaS usage-based billing can handle those core functions. But, like, maybe what are some of the edge cases, what are the corner cases, gotchas that, whether you're choosing a SaaS product or you're actually, like, building something by yourself, that you need to be thinking about? You've mentioned to me, like, entitlements being something that people don't maybe think a lot about. What are some other things that you can think of that people should be aware of as they go into that process?
Yeah, so I think entitlements is actually a good one, because, and state changes. Okay, so if you think you're a freemium SaaS company, you have these users that are changing from free to the paid and then enterprise, right? And one of the things, and I think a lot of companies do this, but also at Heroku, is, like, think about Snowflake, actually, right? So if you go sign up for Snowflake right now and you don't do an enterprise, you just put in a credit card, right? They, like, you consume credits. Those credits are worth X amount, and then they give you a bill at the end of the month and say, okay, you have to pay us this, right? But then when you're on enterprise, you're saying, I'm going to buy 1,000 X amount of credits, whatever, for the whole year, and I'm going to burn down, right? So now not only are you, like, you're billing in arrears, saying, like, okay, you used this last month for the credit card people, but now you're saying, well, I have to burn down credits for my enterprise people. And then things get real wacky when it's like, I'm in the middle of a month. I've spent $1,000 on credit card, but I just signed up for an enterprise contract. So, like, how do I do that? Do I charge for this much and then it goes to the credit thing? Honestly, that's one of the hardest problems to solve, is when you do this, like, direct, we called it direct, but, like, self-serve credit card to enterprise and back again. That shit gets wonky too. And then again, this is all, like, your enterprise sales process is going through, like, a CRM, like a Salesforce or whatever. And then there's, like, a contract, there's, like, ACH stuff. So a lot of times the billing isn't even done through, like, in Heroku's case, we didn't even take care of the bills for the enterprise customers. That was done by, like, accounting Salesforce people. So we didn't even know really if they were on or off, or if they were up to date on their bill. The only time we would get notified is if the, like, basically accounting people at Salesforce would have to, like, I don't even know what they did, probably email the CSV or Excel sheet. They would always do stupid crap like that. But, just very manual processing, right? And so by having an entitlement service that can sort of, like, contain that state, really you kind of want to contain the history, right? Of, like, this customer started as free, then they went to credit card, and they went to enterprise, and they went back again. And I need to know, like, what's the whole history of that customer. And of course, that also changes what they're allowed to do in the product, right? A lot of times enterprise features are much different than the credit card features. They get additional, you get SSO or, whatever the feature is that people want to buy for that stuff. So I think to me, that's kind of the part that I haven't seen on the usage-based SaaS company side, is like all that kind of out of band, more manual, that kind of stuff seems to be lacking from what I've seen. And I think it honestly, it's painful. Like,
yeah,
it's not easy to do. You end up with multiple billing models. And then honestly, you also have to sort of, you're almost like completely changing it, right? Because it's like, I'm doing a credit burn down versus I'm just like paying money for my usage, right? So it's like completely different that way.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I have a question too, like kind of maybe shifting a little bit, but I mean, inherently, like the process of invoicing on usage is a batch process. Like you're going back in time and you're looking at, aggregations, right? But I think one of the things that you're seeing a lot in kind of the new usage-based pricing approach is not only actually billing, but then like giving that customer the real-time look into, what am I going to pay for? Where do I stand right now? To kind of use the credits, like how many credits do I have left right now? And that's a real-time problem in a world that, in an invoicing kind of mindset that's typically batch. Can you talk about, and Alasdair, feel free to kind of chip in here too, because I think you have a lot of experience on the real-time architecture side. Like, how are these SaaS tools helping to solve that real-time problem of then pointing the data back to the customers and kind of showing that how they're going to be invoiced?
Well, it's an interesting, right? Because it goes back to something that Alex was saying of that your usage system is not necessarily the same one as your billing system, right? And usage can feed into, yes, billing, but also show your customers what they are doing. Because quite often, like the AWS one, you can sit there and consume loads of services, and it's quite difficult to know this is my burn rate, right? And then at the end of the month, you get this crazy bill, and you're like, okay, I didn't mean to spend that much, right? But if you had a nice chart that's showing you exactly, the dollars racking up as you go, you spin up a service, and immediately you see the difference. You're like, shit, that's going to be way too high at the end of the month, and it changes your behavior, it changes how you use the service.
Which is exactly why Jeff Bezos has said not to build that at AWS, because that's how these companies make money. But I digress.
Yeah, so I think it's a great point, and actually, I think that is one of the things that I think any usage-based SaaS, or even if you're building it internally, you'll need to support that kind of use case. I think consumers are getting to the point where they're like, I do want to be able to see a pretty much real-time picture of how much I've used, and not only just used from like a billing perspective, but I think people are interested in seeing like just operationally, like especially you think of these sort of like newer PaaS companies like Vercel, Netlify, and all that kind of stuff. Like I need to see like how many requests am I getting and how much bandwidth is being used, and my serverless functions and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot that customers want to be able to see, and they want to see it real time. Like I don't think like I said, Heroku, we were just doing it every night, right? And I think at the time I was like, oh yeah, man, you guys are kicking ass. Like every night, that's crazy. But I think fast forward 5 years, it's like, well, no, now I want to be able to see it up to the minute at the very least. And yeah, I mean, and get Alasdair, I guess, to help you figure out the real-time stuff.
Well, it's an interesting one, right? Because for somebody the size of AWS, as Cameron kind of joked, that they don't actually really have to care because they've got kind of a captive market of, well, you don't really have a choice. You're going to use AWS, Azure, or Google. You're going to use one. But for the smaller vendors who are doing usage-based pricing, you're not in that level of having all of your customers basically captive, and they will go, bloody hell, that's expensive, go somewhere else, right? So being able to actually work with your customers and not squeeze them for everything they're worth, and actually show them how to be cost efficient and that you care about their cost, that you're not just fleecing them, is going to be a huge differentiator of the competition who go, yeah, well, we don't care. You burn loads of credits, that's good for us, but then you'll bugger off in 6 months.
Yeah.
So kind of thinking about the real-time then problem, I guess, one question I have, and this is maybe for both of you, but it's just like, okay, you built the system at Heroku 5+ years ago. And obviously there's a lot of change happen in 5 to 7 years in data tech, and you can call it the modern data stack if you dare. I know that leaves a bad taste in people. Alasdair, your grimace gives it away. That's fine. It doesn't matter. But it can maybe change the way that we approach this problem, and even the decision on whether to build versus buy. And so I think one of the things that I wonder is like, if you could go back and build it with technology that you have now, how might you actually approach that build problem? But also too is like, as real-time analytical processing architectures become more popular and more mainstream, like, is it making it easier to build this kind of thing with that particular use case we just talked about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think, Kafka has kind of gotten mature, and, I think Cloudflare just got their like trillionth event through Kafka or something. Read some article about that today, which is bananas. But like, the technologies for dealing with real time are becoming more mature and more able to sort of service those use cases, right? And I think the thing is also sort of like being able to transform the data, right? Aggregate in the ways that you need to in that real-time way is also obviously key. And I think from the like modern data stack perspective, because big time data as a company, like, we're building data warehousing, analytics, and all that kind of stuff. And I think you don't want to underrate how important it is to get that like real-time data not only flowing in for the customers to see and for like your billing service to deal with and all that, but then there's the whole like back office analytics part where it's like, is this invoice going up, or like who's growing, who's going down, all the things that sales and marketing and, your COO is going to care about, right? What is the board going to care about? So it really becomes just like intertwined system. And I just think, I don't necessarily know if we're 100% in the real time like vein, right? Like, people finally got to like Snowflake, and you sort of have that benefit. And you can, Snowpipe and stuff like that. There are certain technologies that are coming out or that are like sort of maturing and being used, but it's still always going to be sort of this like half and half real time versus batch that I think is tricky to use. But I think from like a billing perspective and a usage perspective, having that sort of real time data stream that you're doing the aggregations on real time is, that's the future, man. Let's do it.
Alasdair, do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, I don't want to turn this into just me going on a diatribe of modern data stack, but the thing with the modern data stack, right, is that it was almost exclusively built as something to handle like strategic needs, right, which is the historical. So go over and look at the past month's usage, create a bill, and send it to people. And the modern data stack is basically just, how do you do that but not use Hadoop? Right. That's fundamentally all it is, right? And it's so hard to then tack on to that architecture the operational stuff. And usage-based is fundamentally an operational thing. It is real-time, it's continuous. So being able to show the customer these real-time insights so that they can take actions on it, if you're just in that modern data stack paradigm and you're trying to build everything out of your warehouse, you're not going to do it. So you do have to start a lot earlier. You have to say, we're not just building an strategic architecture. This has to serve both operational and strategic, because it changes fundamentally how you're going to architect the whole platform.
So Alasdair and Alex, feel free to chime in too, but like, if you apply that to this particular use case on usage-based billing, like, how would you approach that problem? Not just tacking on some kind of a whatever real-time something to this existing architecture? I mean, how do you approach that problem? How do you do that?
Well, this is where I toe the line of, do I pull out my put my tiny bird hat on?
Let's go.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not, that's not
See, there was a
question.
product called Tiny Bird. That's not the specific problem.
Damn it. No, that's not where I was headed. But go
it's
for
an
it.
interesting one. I mean, this is kind of why, my very first question to Alex, I think, was, why did you go with Postgres back in the day? And, it's, when I first started and I was doing cybersecurity stuff, we didn't have Flink really in those days. Even like the Spark streaming stuff was like early, and I mean, it's still not very good. And, having like hyper scaling low latency systems was pretty uncommon. You kind of had HBase, and that was like as good as it got, and Elasticsearch was kind of kicking off, but it wasn't quite right for everything. So, I mean, there's just so many options now. Of everybody's got low latency systems. You got ClickHouse going in for the super low latency. You got Pinot, and it's no longer just how do we already use Postgres. Like, how do we try and make Postgres a bit quicker? If we stick Redis in front of it, and I'll make it nice and quick, right? But it also means that it's not very. You're looking at old data, So you're looking at the state of the world 5 minutes ago, let's say, and how for some things that's fine, but for others not so much. So it'd be interesting to know. Obviously, I have a bias, right? But it'd be interesting to know from Alex's point of view, who's slightly less biased. If you were approaching that problem today and you didn't want to go full and abuse Postgres, what kind of things would you be looking at?
I mean, one of the ones that I had been looking at that I thought was going to end up being really cool, but seems like it hasn't panned out, which maybe they are. I haven't really looked in a little bit, but like Materialize and the whole data flow kind of architecture stuff. I thought that, I was like, okay, this is it. This is like what we can go with. Obviously you're going to have some kind of Kafka stream and stuff like that, which honestly adds its own, any of this stuff adds complexity, right? Again, billing is hard. Like, this isn't going to be super straightforward. But I think it's like, if we can have the technology, or really just an implementation of some technology that really can support this in a clean way, right? Like, think about before we had Stripe at all, right? And like, it was a nightmare, right? Like, we used Braintree at Heroku. And so we were just like sending like, charge this credit card this much money, right? Like, there was no bells and whistles at all. And I think what we need to see is sort of that next evolution that gets us to where we want to go, right? Which is like a real-time usage-based billing system that, works for everybody again, right? Like, it has to support all these different things. And I think it's difficult. And I guess we'll see where do we land in a year,
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice to see how the space is maturing, because it's still, relatively new, but it's actually not that. It's not in its infancy anymore, So Flink is pretty mature now, and still pretty hard to use. But there are people now trying to make it a lot easier to use. And real-time systems are now I already named a few, but there's loads more of them, and they're kind of purpose-built for the problem. Whereas, you've got some things where they've tried to reuse the old technologies that you're already familiar with, and then go, how do we stick that onto it, right? So you've got people that have done layers on top of Postgres to make it a bit quicker, and I mean, that'll work. And then but it's and things like, I mean, I'm a big critic of KSQL DB. I mean, it's just everybody loves Kafka, and I love Kafka. It's a great tool, does a brilliant job at what it does. But then they've gone, right, now people want to do processing on top of streams. How can we make Kafka do that? And it's like, when when all you've got is a hammer, you know, every problem looks like a nail, and that's just how I feel about KSQL DB.
We are now a KSQL DB webinar.
Yeah. Well, I'd honestly be just curious to like peruse the engineering job posts at some of these usage-based billing SaaS companies. Like, what are they hiring for? It might clue us into, hey, how are they building it? Because obviously it's a problem they're trying to solve every day, and it would seem like this, that they're very aware of the real-time architecture problem. So I don't know, maybe we could do that in our spare time. Actually, there's a tool for that. But anyways, Alex, question, like maybe just to close this out is, you obviously consult with a lot of people on this particular problem. I mean, maybe just some parting thoughts for like how you were helping your clients approach the build versus buy problem, or maybe even just more generically, like how to approach the usage-based billing and making that transition.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing I've said it before, I'll say it again, but I've sort of, this architecture, sort of the usage service, the billing service, and entitlements, like having that, it's really the conceptual in your mind, like these are separate things that need to be dealt with in separate ways. Like that's the thing I keep harping on to like anybody that we deal with. I think the other part, like a lot of it's kind of the people problem and just like organizational problem. One thing I didn't mention, but at Heroku, the billing engineering team was under BizOps, and that contained also data engineering and analytics and stuff. So we were kind of on like the operational business side of things. And so we were an engineering team that wasn't on engineering, which had some pros and cons, right? Because, we kind of could have our own priorities that weren't what engineering was trying to do with the product. But at the same time, you were a little farther away from engineering. So they'd be like, oh, hey, we just shipped this new feature. We need to price for it. And we're like, okay. And they'd be like, can you get that done like today? It's like, I don't know what you're thinking is going to happen here, bro. But I think like, I try to, again, like speak the different languages of all the different teams to try to like make sure everybody like understands really what's going on and like where their piece of the puzzle flows. And then like from the engineering sort of like real-time perspective, it's like we can sort of compartmentalize again, like, okay, that can be part of the usage service, right? So then all this other stuff can kind of be on its own thing. We don't have to like complicate everybody with everybody touching the same things all the time. And then it just gets messy and, accounting gets pissed at you, but you're like, yeah, whatever.
So if there's one thing you take away.
I love it.
Yeah, if there's one thing you take away, like just work with Alex on this stuff because billing is hard.
Because
it's a
billing is
Rubik's
hard.
Cube. Yeah. Well, this has been cool. And Alasdair, Alex, anything you guys want to add before we drop off? I don't think anybody have any like chat questions. I haven't seen anything come across. So, who watches webinars live anymore anyway? So, anyways, if you guys have anything else, yes, no.
You can go to bigtimedata.io, message us. But yeah, we're, I don't know. We love this stuff. Like anything to do with data. I love all this billing stuff, and yeah.
Cool. Well, guys, thanks for giving your time, and we'll keep talking about this conversation. I mean, this conversation will continue for sure. So, appreciate you guys, and we'll talk soon.
Sweet.
All right.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye, y'all.
Cheers, guys.